Hello, I'm Peggy Cornett, Curator of Plants at Monticello. Welcome to the gardens.
Peggy, how long have you been with Monticello, and tell us about your job here?
Okay, well, I've been at Monticello since 1983. The first few years I was here, we were just completing the restoration of this incredible vegetable garden behind me. The 1,000-foot long terrace was completed along with a massive stone wall supporting it. Shortly thereafter, the garden pavilion, they began construction on the restoration of this beautiful garden pavilion that stands at the midpoint of the garden. And some of the first things we were doing at that time, we were saving seed of the tennis ball lettuce. It was our first season to successfully grow this crop. And the blue Prussian pea was another crop that I remember saving seed from. Today, of course, the gardeners here at Monticello are also growing plants in the same greenhouses where I was working for the gardens. They're doing a beautiful job. And I've been here for almost 37 years.
Can you give us an overview of the gardens and the grounds?
Well, the gardens are really the culmination of Jefferson's lifetime of his ideas for this little mountain. He first referred to Monticello in his garden book in 1769, and during that year he began grafting and budding fruit trees on the south slope of the mountain. He dreamed of developing a beautiful garden around the house, as well as to create a landscape that included functional aspects of his farm. He was certainly growing vegetables on this south-facing slope, and in 1806, when he was still President of the United States, he was having the flower gardens and the vegetable gardens laid out, constructed. Massive work was being done here in anticipation of his retirement in 1809. So the gardens are really at least 40, 50 years of Jefferson's planning and developing them.
How about today? Can you tell us what's in bloom now?
Well, today, the flower gardens, of course, the Garden Club of Virginia actually restored the gardens in the late 1930s to 41, and they based their research on Jefferson's garden diaries, his letters, his drawings, his overseer messages to his overseers, and so we learned a great deal just from the written documentation about the gardens. So when they restored the gardens in the early 1940s, they were able to put back a lot of the same design and plants that Jefferson grew. And nowadays, of course, we're still searching for the same plants that Jefferson mentions in his documentation. It's kind of a detective story. We try to seek out these plants from all parts of the world. We've just had a beautiful display of tulips in the garden, and I even brought a couple of very interesting tulips to show you because Jefferson was cultivating some very unusual tulips in his garden. These were the types of tulips people would find very interesting in his day, more so than the large single-colored types that we grow today. And of course, we have a wonderful display of flowers coming into bloom now that will be succeeding the tulips, the biennials, the hardy annuals, sweet William, poppies, Canterbury bells. Also, some of the perennials like the peonies are starting to flower right now, the beautiful European peony. And the flags, or the iris, which are also coming into bloom.
You mentioned Jefferson's Documents. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Right. Yeah, well, I mentioned that he had a garden book, and he started writing in this book when he was 23 years old. And he kept this garden diary until 2 years before his death. So it was almost 60 years of his life. He was making records about his gardens. Some of them were very detailed, some were brief. But he also wrote many letters throughout his lifetime, and his correspondence has been, of course, accumulated over the years. And we know a great deal about his gardens just from his writings to his friends, to other political figures, to seedsmen and other botanists that he knew quite well. We also know a lot of Jefferson's interest in gardens from the things that he ordered. He was ordering plants and seeds from Bernard McMahon, one of his primary suppliers of flowers and vegetables from Philadelphia. And the Bartrams were also a big source of plants for Thomas Jefferson. So all of these records have been combined in a very large garden book called Thomas Jefferson's Garden Book, which was edited by Edwin Betts. And we still use this today a great deal to help us understand the garden.
You mentioned you spent some years on a satellite farm. Tell us about some of the other things that go on here at Monticello. Tell us about the Center for Historic Plants.
That's right. In 1986, we started a program called the Thomas Jefferson Center for Historic Plants, and the headquarters are located at Tufton Farm, which is one of Jefferson's satellite farms. He owned 5,000 acres here in Albemarle County. And the Center for Historic Plants, their mission is to collect and preserve historic plant varieties, to propagate them, and to educate the public about the importance of preserving historic plants. You know, a lot of people are interested in maintaining native plants, which are very important, but there are also a number of cultivated plants that can be endangered if they're not kept in cultivation. So the Center for Historic Plants not only collects vegetable crops, but also ornamental plants as well, roses and historic plants such as that. And the center has still thriving. Today they are very active, making sure that they're able to keep up with their mail order, and they've been shipping out hundreds of packets of seeds. This year we're probably going to sell over 100,000 packets of seeds from the plants that are grown here at Monticello.
Got a question from the live stream, Peggy.
Yeah.
Carol wants to know if you have a favorite place in the garden.
Wow. Well, I do love being in the flower gardens. That's always a special time for me. I love, you know, walking through the vegetable garden. I could do this several times a day and see the crops. But I also have a special love for the woodlands here at Monticello, and I do spend a good deal of time studying the wildflowers that grow in the mountain and trying to keep track of them, because they're the same types of plants that Jefferson talked about in his garden diaries.
And Denise wants to know, do we know where Jefferson first saw tulips?
Where he first saw tulips? Oh, that's a good question. He started mentioning tulips, you know, in the at least the 1780s, but it was possibly earlier. You know, he lived in Williamsburg, and so he might have seen tulips cultivated there. He was definitely aware of tulips because they were so popular, even going back to the 1630s. There was a huge rage for tulips at that time. So I'm not sure if he ever really documented the first tulip he saw. He may have also seen them when he was living in France and sending plants and bulbs back from France. That would have been in the 1780s.
And Natalia wants to know if the garden looks the same today as it looked in Jefferson's day.
Well, we might keep it a little neater, but I think a lot of it is pretty accurate. We know the flower gardens probably had a little more to them than what we have today. The Garden Club of Virginia made some decisions to accommodate our many visitors that come here, so they might have left out some shrubbery beds, for example. And the vegetable garden, though, is quite spectacular, and as you can see, we've restored it to the same grade. It's 80 feet wide, and as I said, 1,000 feet long, and it's divided into 24 squares. So I think the vegetable garden is quite accurate as far as its location. Of course, all of this is based on before we actually restored these gardens, we've done extensive archaeological investigation to make sure that they're located in the right place. The archaeologists also uncovered, of course, the locations for the fruit trees in the fruitery, which is below the vegetable garden on this side of the mountain.
What do you do with the produce grown in the gardens today from Monticello and Tufton?
Well, we do quite a bit with the produce. A lot of it is grown for display, of course, to show the many varieties. We've documented at least 330 different varieties of vegetables and herbs in this garden. But we also want to preserve these plants for the future, for our use and also for the public. So we grow a lot of vegetables and actually let them go to seed in the garden. And so a lettuce plant is not the prettiest thing when it goes to seed, but it's very important, and this is an educational part of what we do. Now we also, of course, use some of these vegetables for our farm table cafe, and more and more we're beginning to provide the produce from the gardens for the public consumption. And of course, Monticello has events in the evenings and so forth that these vegetables are used. And then some of us gardeners like to take a few things home with us and eat them when we have a chance. A head of lettuce, a bunch of kale, very nice.
Is there a plant named after Thomas Jefferson?
There definitely is. I have, it already finished blooming. It flowers in early spring. This year it flowered in March. It's a wildflower, and so I brought the leaf of this plant so that you can see why its common name is called twin leaf. You can see how it's a two-parted leaf, looks like butterfly wings. But the plant named after Thomas Jefferson, its Latin name is Jeffersonia diphylla, and diphylla means two-parted leaf. And Jefferson was quite honored by having a plant named for him, a botanical namesake. In 1792, the botanist Benjamin Smith Barton made a proclamation before a meeting of the American Philosophical Society. And Jefferson was a member of this society, which promoted the ideals of the Enlightenment for 17 years. And during his statement naming this flower after Jefferson, he said, it was not for his political contributions to America, it was for his knowledge of botany and natural history, which was exceeded by few others in this country. So again, Jefferson was quite honored. Very few people had plants named after them, and this is one that was named after Thomas Jefferson. It's a wildflower.
Wendy is curious if we know Jefferson's favorite time of year in terms of edible plants. Did he like spring foods, fall food?
Well, of course, spring was very important. In fact, he was always so eager to get out and have the peas planted in the spring. Sometimes his garden diary indicates they were planting peas in February, March, and he would track when these crops would be harvested, and so he had a wonderful column in his garden book saying, come to table. So this is when it came to table. So we know he liked the peas, but he also liked just many vegetables, especially spring crops, cabbages and broccolis, and of course root crops, carrots, beets, and so forth. But Jefferson was also growing some very unusual crops in his garden, that for his day at least, such as tomatoes, and crops like sesame. He was very interested in developing an oil crop, a domestic oil crop for this country. Olive oil was very scarce and difficult to obtain. It would be rancid by the time it made it here from Europe. And he tried growing olives, and he wasn't successful. But he did have some success growing sesame and pressing it for oil. And in fact, they had a blind taste testing when he was president at the president's house, and the sesame was a favorite oil.
Jacqueline asks if you have any Jeffersonian advice for us novice gardeners.
Well, Jefferson's granddaughter was very concerned about her garden at one point, and he said, well, the problem is your soil is too lean, and next year we're going to add a lot of, well, let's say manure to the garden, and so that your vegetables and your flowers can bid defiance to disease and insects. And so really his cure for a lot of gardening ills was to really have a good foundation, a good soil, and we can all believe in that today.
So enslaved people kept these gardens. Did they have gardens of their own at Monticello as well?
Absolutely. There were many gardens kept by the enslaved here. They had their own plots of land around where their dwellings were located. And in fact, we know that there were many crops cultivated that they were able to sell to the Jefferson household. Jefferson's granddaughters were negotiating purchases from many of the enslaved who lived here. And of course, it was a difficult life for them. They labored from sun up to sundown for Jefferson's gardens and the farms. And so they were actually working in their own gardens after dark, lighting them by burning cauldrons of fat, or working on Sunday. That was their day off. So, but it was a way to make some money, and so they were able to make some money so that they could buy things for themselves on occasion. Cabbages, cucumbers, crops out of season were very often sold to the Jefferson household.
And there were plants that had African origins or Native American origins in that garden?
Well, the other squashes and were Native American, of course. From Africa, there are crops like eggplant and the sesame, and of course okra. And Jefferson had some interesting planting schemes for okra. One year they were planted around an entire square of tomatoes. And they also have an interesting recipes for an okra stew that's sort of like a gumbo, what we would think of as a gumbo today, with tomatoes, okra, potatoes, and some other vegetables. It sounded delicious, actually. Yeah.
And Laura is curious if we have Lewis and Clark plants growing at Monticello, and what kinds?
Yes, indeed. Part of Jefferson's interest in sending the expedition to the west was to bring back plants to the east, and he was very interested in crops. And so, when Lewis and Clark were spent a winter with the Mandan and Arikara and Hidatsa tribes in the North Dakota, they were able to send back some of these crops. Today, we're still growing the Arikara bean, the Arikara sunflower, and the Mandan corn in the gardens. And they also sent back kind of ornamental crops such as the gaillardia, the blanket flower, and a plant named Linum lewisia, which is named after Meriwether Lewis. It's a beautiful blue flax. They sent back Clarkia, which was named after William Clark, a very beautiful annual flower. And they also sent back the snowberry. And this was a very popular plant for the grandchildren especially. It has a beautiful white berry. It doesn't do very well here in Virginia, but it is a very abundant plant on the West Coast. And in fact, when it was sent to England, it became naturalized there as well. So the snowberry is a very commonly seen shrub in England as well.
Mark asks, did Jefferson bring back plants and seeds from France?
Yes, he did. He sent back plants as well. The Marseille fig, we believe, was sent back from France with Jefferson. Of course, if you were, some of the other crops were some vegetables that he had sent back with him. We also know that he brought back, of course, upland rice from Italy when he was traveling there on penalty of death, by the way. So it was quite a scary thing for him to do, but he was trying again to introduce a useful plant to American culture. So yeah, there are a number of plants that he was certainly interested in when he was in France as well.
And Karen from Princeton is curious if Jefferson knew about crop rotation or companion planting.
Well, yes, he did. He was, in the 1790s, Jefferson wrote that he wanted to become an ardent farmer. During that decade, he really wanted to retire to Monticello. He said that he wanted to retire to his family, his books, and his farms and his affairs. And at that time, he was also coming up with really kind of very useful crop rotation schemes for his satellite farms. Up until that point, they were cultivating tobacco exclusively, which was really robbing the soil of nutrients. And so when Jefferson came back to Monticello after his time in France, he realized that his lands were very poor and eroded. So crop rotation was employed, a very elaborate scheme for planting wheat and then legumes to replenish the soil, letting the soil rest. Corn was also planted. So tobacco was actually rotated out of cultivation here in Albemarle County. And we're not sure if he actually knew about companion planting, but he was growing some plants near each other, like more as an ornamental conceit, we think.
Philip is curious if we have a first pea to table contest, as Jefferson did.
We've done this on occasion, not this year, but I think we would win it this year because everything went into the ground so early, and we've had a very mild spring, and we haven't had killing frosts since early March. So we have done this on some years, and of course there's a whole program called the Edible Schoolyard, something that was inspired by Alice Waters. And so a lot of school groups try to reenact this pea contest. Many years ago we did it, and when we knew the landscape manager at Farmington Country Club, which was where George Divers lived. And so I think we tried to reenact it that year, but that was probably 30 years ago.
Lee wants to know if Jefferson kept having tobacco grown.
Tobacco never stopped being cultivated down in Bedford County, where Jefferson had his retreat home at Poplar Forest. Tobacco was a very reliable cash crop, and Jefferson was also often strapped for income, and so it was very difficult to stop growing it altogether. But he did want to transition to wheat here in Albemarle County.
Are there any original trees at Monticello from Jefferson's time?
Well, we had two original trees near the house, two tulip poplars, beautiful stately trees. Jefferson loved the tulip poplar. He said the tulip poplar and the white oak were the Juno and Jupiter of our groves. They were taken down in recent years. 2008 was the largest, oldest tree taken down. And then in 2012 we took down the second one, which was near the house. And when we had the rings counted, we dated that one to 1808. So we know that was an original tree. Now there are other trees on the mountain that we speculate might be original, and we really won't know until we're able to verify them scientifically by dendrology. There's a red cedar that is believed to be from Jefferson's day, but we still don't know that for sure. Yeah.
Claudia wants to know if the grass was kept mowed then, if it's different now.
I think we probably manicure the grass a lot more nowadays than in Jefferson's day. Of course, there weren't lawnmowers in his day, but they would sickle and scythe the lawn probably 2 or 3 times a year. He did grow grass and wanted it around the house, and he also wanted grass established down in the woodlands where he created a grove. He wanted to open up the woodlands. He once wrote that under the constant beaming, almost vertical sun of Virginia, shade is our Elysium. So he wanted to open up the forest and limb up the trees and plant grass beneath them so that you could walk unencumbered through this shady, meadow-like environment. But no, I think Jefferson's grass and his lawns were probably a little rougher than what we see today.
And also, did Jefferson bring grapes from Europe to try to make wine here?
Well, he did import grapes here. He was he really had some refined taste, you might say, when it comes to wine. And he was trying to grow the European grape here, the Vitis vinifera. And it is a very delicate grape, you might say. It's not as vigorous as our native grape. And so we know that he never really was successful in making a bottle of wine at Monticello, as far as we know. There were many attempts to establish his vineyards here, but we are successful with the native grapes, and our restored vineyards today are actually grafted, European grapes are grafted onto the very vigorous rootstock of our wild grapes here in Virginia. And this is done all over the world because there are many diseases that our domestic grapes are resistant to.
We hear a lot about bees. Do we have bees here at Monticello?
We do. We have a beekeeper who is maintaining beehives here at Monticello. They're a little bit off-site, and it's quite wonderful because we're able to have them pollinating our gardens, and we're harvesting honey from them, and wonderful products are being produced from the honey coming from the beehives. The honey, the raw honey, is so delicious, and one of my favorite things is the soaps that we're making with honey in them. It's just, they smell wonderful. So definitely check out some of the things that we're producing from our own beehives here at Monticello and also at Tufton Farm. Quite a few bees are kept there as well.
Calvin wants to know if there were similar gardens at Poplar Forest.
Well, Poplar Forest was quite a unique landscape. It's even hard to explain. It had curtilages and rows of mulberries and mounds planted with weeping willows and golden willows, and so it was a very unique landscape. But he did have a vegetable garden there, and I understand today that the archaeologists are making a good progress in actually determining the location of the site of the vegetable garden. And they're also replanting the clumps of trees that have been that were documented by Jefferson, and they've been able to figure out that they were in a very unique spiraling configuration. So there's a lot of work going on right now to restore the gardens at Poplar Forest, and so stay tuned in coming years for a lot of changes that are happening there now. And they also have some original tulip poplars on the landscape there that are just magnificent.
Thomas wants to know if there are any new Gardens and Grounds initiatives coming here at Monticello.
Well, I think that recently one of the most important things we're doing is developing the Center for Historic Plants into more of an innovative farm to demonstrate farming techniques for small-scale farming. So they're expanding what is being cultivated there out into the fields beyond just the 3-acre nursery area at Tufton. I think there's going to be a lot going on in future years to see at that location. And we're also providing, of course, food crops for the Farm Table Cafe, which we want to really showcase good eating, farm-to-table style eating at our cafe. So we're really making a big effort to provide so much of that for our guests who come here.
All right, we have time for one final question.
Oh.
If you could just tell us a little bit about what's going on right now with the gardens, with the closure, and what's the next couple of steps?
Well, we've had, essential staff is maintaining the gardens today, and they're doing a beautiful job. I don't know if you can see how everything looks so pristine in the vegetable garden, and the flower gardens as well are really looking nice. So when the time comes when we can open again, we certainly hope people can spend many hours wandering these gardens and learning more about them. We do a lot, of course, live stream like we're doing today, and we have a lot of social media opportunities, such as we hope, if you haven't already, we hope you'll join our Monticello Farm and Garden Facebook page. Monticello has several opportunities through the different departments to join Facebook pages, the archaeologists, for example. And we're also trying to just reach out as much as we can to our many friends out there who may not be able to come here today, but will soon. Thank you again for coming.